Thank you, Bishop Baker. To our honored guests, to Bishop Sloan, to the various civil servants who are present here this morning, the ministers of the pulpit, lay people, some of my church members who are all present today for this worthwhile discussion. I'm honored that Bishop Baker called upon me as he was going about the process of planning this event and told me what the goals would be in light of all of the things that were going on around this country and around the world, how we need to come back and refocus on how we can bring people together as opposed to dividing people. And when he told me of the possibility of having Joe Riley as part of this august occasion, I was simply delighted. No matter where you go in this country, when you run across a new mayor, someone who's just been elected, and they call upon all the other mayors as to, well, what should I do, or where's the manual on how to be a mayor? We all say one thing: call Joe Riley or read Joe Riley's book. Mayor Riley is the dean of all mayors throughout this country. The people who have served under him in city government in Charleston hold many, many positions all around the country and are doing great things. In fact, David Agnew, I think he was your chief of staff at one time. David Agnew became the head of governmental affairs for the president in the White House. So Mayor Joe's hand goes all over this country, and we're honored to have him here today to share words of wisdom with us. Having been born during a time of segregation in Birmingham, Alabama, I've seen the changes that have occurred. I don't know how many of you who have salt and pepper hair out there in the audience were born here, but if you were, you remember a time when there were certain things we just didn't do. And oftentimes we had no idea why we didn't do it. That's just the way it was. And I recall growing up, and I saw Bill over here, one of my childhood friends. My grandmother lived in a neighborhood in Fairfield that there were whites and blacks living in the general area. And as kids, we used to all play together. It wasn't black kids playing with white kids. It was just children playing with children. And as we got older, that whole concept of segregation just gradually seeped into our being, that one child might say, I went to the Bama Drive-In Theater and saw Snow White. And another child was asking, what does it feel like to go to that drive-in? Because that black child could never go. Or would be limited to going on a TV program in the afternoons that have birthday parties for children, Cousin Cliff and Benny Carl, those of you who remember those two afternoon shows. And every day they would have little white kids on there talking about their birthdays and their friends and so forth. And probably once a month they would allow black kids on that program. But nobody thought anything about it. That's just the way it was. And as people became more aware of the limitations on their lives, more aware of the discrimination that was taking place against them, that limited them in their ability to move up in society, questions began to be raised. And it started in Montgomery with the Selma bus boycott. That really started out just wanting to be treated like a human being. That's all, nothing more, just treated like a human being. And I tell people all the time that human rights was the genesis of civil rights. And human rights is those God-given rights that every man and woman who walk this earth are endowed with by God. Civil rights, on the other hand, is an attempt to codify some of those God-given rights in such a way that to violate them would have civil consequences to it. And so as the process began to unfold of dismantling segregation in our society, there became conflict among people who wanted to keep things the way they were. But the vast majority of people were silent, both black and white. They were silent because that's the way it always was. And they did not know what change would bring about. But as people saw the ugliness of segregation, not just the separation in terms of going to entertainment venues or shopping or going to restaurants and things of that nature, but the violence that was wreaked upon individuals simply because of their color, the world became outraged. It started out just a shaking of the head, said, we don't understand why it is like that in the South. But then, on that tragic day when the bombing occurred at 16th Street Baptist Church, a bombing that was not only heard all across this city, but it was heard around the world, it galvanized people's attention. More importantly, it brought people together and said, we must change. And I oftentimes tell people that it wasn't just black folks that stood against the dogs and the hose pipes, but there were whites also. There were Christians, there was Muslims, there were Jews. People of all religions stood up and said, we must make a change in our society. And that long walk to making that change was a very difficult walk. But we turned it around. It was turned around to create the society in Birmingham and in Alabama and throughout the Southeast that we have today. And I oftentimes look back on what I know to be a fact as to the things that occurred in my city. I think about the new generation, the younger generation, who have no clue what it means to walk up to a water fountain and see the sign saying whites only. And if you're an African-American child, you know that you can't drink out of that water fountain. They have no concept of what it feels like to be in that type of society, or to be limited where you can go, what you can do, who you can be with, and things of that nature. But I look back on the biblical references that we have to guide us today. When the children of Israel were freed from Egypt, and they wandered for 40 years. And as generations died off from those who were in bondage and in captivity, and new generations were born, the knowledge of what happened to them in captivity was being lost. And it's the same thing with our younger generation now. They don't understand what we had to go through in order to get here. And oftentimes it seems like just a myth or a wives' tale that someone tells to either pump themselves up as to how hard it was when they were a child, but it goes over the young people's head. But just like the Israelites were admonished that as we go forth from this place, let every tribe gather up a stone and carry that stone with you. And as generations pass and new generations are formed and come about, they will ask the question, why do we have that stone? And that should spark a conversation about from whence they came and what they had to overcome in order to be a free people living in the land of Israel. And so we have to create those stones ourselves so that we can continue to remind our young people of the bridges we've crossed, of the travails we've overcome, so that they will understand that we must always continue to be vigilant, to not let those things happen again. And I think sometimes when we see headlines of people being shot or killed because of their color, or someone being caustic against another because of their religion or their race, we tend to forget how we overcame those things in the past. And that's by good men and women of great faith coming together to make those changes. And so we come here today to say, with all the headlines that are going on, how do we go back and recapture that spirit of we're not going to allow this to destroy our society? How do we bring people together for a common cause? You think that, well, maybe if we just stand together and bond together, we can overcome evil that's out there. Well, that's true. But in standing together, we have to find that common bond, that common humanity that brings us all together, regardless of what our outer shell might look like or what religion we attend to. I look at the fact that oftentimes discrimination comes about through lack of knowledge of another. I can recall back many years ago when I was doing some consultancy work for the State Board of Education. I was asked to go to, I won't call the city, but they were having some difficulties. A little small city not too far from here. They were having some difficulties within their school system based on a racial divide. And when I went to speak to the group, it was in an auditorium divided similar to this chapel. You had blacks sitting on one side, whites sitting on the other side. And I knew then that it would be a difficult task. And I started talking about things of, inclusion, trying to bring people together, and they just looked with a glaze over their eyes like, the only reason we're here is because our superintendent made us come here, but we're not hearing a word you're saying. After the first session, I said, well, I've got to change my tactic. And I knew that I was in a small town, a small community, and just about everybody knew each other, but they didn't know of each other. And so I asked how many people enjoyed fishing, because it was near one of our lakes here in this region. And some hands went up, both black and white, male and female, mostly males. And so I asked all those that enjoyed fishing to come and sit at a table. They went and sat at a table. I said, how many of you all like making quilts? Again, mostly women. I don't call any men raising their hand, but mostly women raised their hands, both black and white. I said, well, you all come up here and you sit at this table. And they were all sitting at the table not knowing what we were going to talk about, and talked about auto mechanics, woodworking, fashion, things of that nature. And pretty soon, I had about 10 tables with people with all like interests. And I told them, just do one thing. Talk about what you like doing about fishing or auto mechanics or sewing, quilting. Just talk about that. And we let them do that for about 45 minutes. And after the lunch break later on, I told them, now, we want everybody to leave the tables and go back to your chairs, and don't want you to sit in the same chair. Just sit next to somebody that you feel comfortable with. And after they came back from the lunch and they all sat down, instead of blacks on one side and whites on the other side, it was all mingled in together. And people were laughing and smiling because they had no idea of the commonality of their interest. And I think oftentimes that's what divides people, because we put up false barriers that prevent us from knowing and understanding who we are and whose we are. And as leaders within our church, as leaders within our community, we've got to find ways to bring people together around a common cause, a positive common cause. And when you do that, you break down those barriers of separation. And you begin to see the humanity within each other. And oftentimes we lose that vision of another's humanity by those false barriers. I think one of the greatest detriments that could have happened was the fact that we've taken religion and prayer out of our classrooms. And whenever I'm questioned about religion and prayer on the campaign trail, I always say, well, it's the law of the land. The Supreme Court says that you cannot have organized prayer in a classroom. But I know for a fact that prayer does go on, because when I was in law school and I had one of my toughest tests, I guarantee you I was praying. And students every day pray when difficulty arises in the classroom. But we've lost that moral compass to a certain degree that used to be instilled in all of our children as to how to treat each other, how to look beyond those differences and see each other for who we are. And we've got to find ways to rebuild that back into our society as a whole. Maybe it's not saying a religious prayer, because some of my good Baptist friends, when we were having that discussion, I said, well, the problem is not necessarily having prayer, but whose prayer? And they said, well, what do you mean? We all pray to the same God, and, a prayer is a prayer. I said, that's true. I said, well, I tell you what, you say a prayer. And my Baptist friend started saying a prayer. And then my Episcopal friend started saying a prayer. And then I said, well, let me say a couple of Hail Marys. And when I started saying Hail Marys, they looked at me funny. I said, see, it's whose prayer you're going to pray. And that's the difficulty that we have. But my approach is that you may not pray my prayer, but please pray a prayer, because that acknowledges that there's a higher power. And that higher power is our common denominator that we all can rally around to eliminate racism in our society. Now, the impact that Birmingham had in rising up to overcome through nonviolent means the ugly stench of segregation really has been felt around the world. Oftentimes we think of it as just either here in the state of Alabama or here within the United States. But in 1993, after Nelson Mandela had been released from Robben Island Prison after some 26 years of incarceration, I had the honor of going and meeting him in Atlanta when he came to thank people in this country for the work that they had done to change the South African society that eventually allowed him to be released from prison. And he made the statement, not just to me, but to a crowded room, that during his imprisonment, the one thing that gave him great hope and encouragement was that if things could change in Birmingham, Alabama, and the American South, then there was hope for change in South Africa. That's the power of the movement that came out of this city. That's the power of the men and women who came together and gradually changed their society so that it would give everyone an opportunity. And when people talk about a man such as Nelson Mandela, who prior to his going into prison, he thought armed resurrection was the only way that his South African brothers could be free of apartheid, he changed his whole attitude, that it wasn't about us against them, but it was about all South Africans, both black and white, being in the same boat and finding common ground through reconciliation and forgiveness. He came forward with the idea that we will acknowledge our faults and our shortcomings, but there will be no retribution, there will be no imprisonment of guards who had done wrong, of police officers, of governmental officials, that all would be forgiven, and that we would create a new society where all of our talents, no matter whether those talents resided in a black woman or a white woman, a black male or a white male, would be available to move South Africa forward to a new day. And so the impact of what happened in this great city has reverberated all around the world. A couple of years ago, when the spring arising took place in Egypt, I remember watching the news, the international news, and there were a group of Egyptian students in a circle singing "We Shall Overcome." And I was just simply amazed of the impact that the civil rights movement here in this country had on movements currently today. I often tell people when I go and speak at places like UNESCO and the UN that while we may think that there's no hope for people living in Arab countries, that there will always be conflict, that there will always be bombings and killings. That was once said about Birmingham, Alabama, but it changed because good men and women stood up. When you see young women and young boys being used as human slaves in other countries, you think it's happening over there, but it's trying to raise its ugly head over here. And we've got to find ways to speak out against that. Because when you understand that discrimination was born out of slavery, and slavery was born out of economic injustices that was placed upon individuals, we've got to stop that today in its track. And we've got to be about the business of recognizing the humanity in each and every one of our individuals who we come in contact with. And finally, let me just say, the Birmingham of today, it is a far cry from what we used to be. It is a city that we all can be proud of, and when I say city, I'm not just talking about the physical city of Birmingham, but this entire metropolitan area. In 2013, prior to 2013, when we were planning a commemoration of 1963, that year that the bombing took place in the church that Reverend Price now pastors, we went to many people, and some people said, well, why don't you just let sleeping dogs die? Why you want to raise that issue? Let's just go on. We don't need to commemorate anything. Birmingham is trying to put that behind us. But I, along with a few others, knew one thing, that as we approached 2013, someone would reach back and pull out those black and white pictures of the hose pipes and the dogs, and it would be blasted on national media, in some cases on CNN worldwide, or MSNBC, or Fox News, and that there would be people out there that would think that Birmingham was still that same place. And right now, when people come here, they're shocked and surprised at the great city that we have. That's because we've tried to hide who we are for so long. And what we set out to do was to tell our own story. Yes, we did have bombings. We did have lynching. We did have a segregated society. But come and see who we are today. Come and see a city that prides itself on all of our people working together to make a positive difference. Come and see what hope can spring forth when good men and women work together. And as we bring people in here, I see Greg Canfield, who has the responsibility of Secretary of Commerce back in the back. He knows when we bring people here, they're shocked and amazed, and then they fall in love with this city. I can recall there was a young man that I worked with back during my Xerox Corporation days that came from Rochester, New York, and he had this long, gloomy face and said, well, I'm only going to be here for a short period of time because my career path said that I had to take a management job, and this was the first management job that was open that I could apply for, but I'm only here for a short period of time. About 6 months later, the corporation offered him another job in another city. He refused to leave. In fact, he quit the Xerox Corporation, got another job, and he resides in this city today, and that happened over 40 years ago. And we see it all the time when people come here. They have that old image of the segregated Birmingham, Alabama, but then when they see the new Birmingham, both black and white, they fall in love with it over and over and over again. And we have to keep on refreshing that love, not just in others' hearts, but in our own hearts, by understanding that each and every day is our obligation to work to bring people together, to eliminate any vestige of racial discrimination. We see on the news each and every day of things that are happening in other places, and each time that my pager goes off in the middle of the night, my cell phone goes off, and I receive a text message from the police chief that there's been a shooting or someone has died at the hands of violence, or I might see a text message that say a police officer had to take someone's life. My heart takes a stop. It stops because it could turn very ugly in an instant, if not the facts have been given to the public as quickly as possible. So we live on that edge where any little thing might bring about racial disharmony in our communities. I mentioned the fact that I've spoken before organizations such as the UN Commission on Racism and Human Rights. This past year when I was over there speaking before that group, I met a gentleman named, I think it was Mark Kappelhoff. And Mark Kappelhoff works with the U.S. Justice Department. And he had been given the task of when he goes back to the U.S. from Geneva to look into what was happening in Ferguson, Missouri. And he knew that I was the head of the African American Mayors Association, and we struck up a conversation. And he asked me, would I be willing to go to Ferguson to look into the matter, to find out from a layman's perspective, not a lawman's perspective, what really happened. And when I got back, the Justice Department, they did send me to Ferguson, Missouri, and we started looking into what were the root causes of that young man being killed on that street in Ferguson, Missouri. And not just the actions that led up to it, him going into a store, stealing from the store, attacking the store owner, the police officer finding him in the street, jaywalking, and conflict arose out of that. But what was the root cause of some of the things that were going on in Ferguson, Missouri? And we found out that you had a separation of people in that community. None of the police officers who worked on the police force lived in Ferguson. None of the police officers who served in Ferguson were of my color. None of the mayors within those small cities that surrounded Ferguson, including Ferguson itself, controlled their police department. Their police department was handled at the county level by a public safety commission. And the way those officers got their money and their raises were through the fines that they raised from giving people tickets and things of that nature. So you had a systemic discriminatory system that was set up, officers being paid out of monies that they could collect by issuing fines against people that they had no relationship other than through law enforcement. They didn't see the humanity in one another. The citizens of Ferguson saw an occupying force that they seemed to think were picking on them. Police officers saw a financial system that rewarded them for giving out as many tickets as they could give out for whatever reason. And so you had conflict and division. And the only solution that can eliminate that type of tension is to bring about some understanding among all people that we're all human beings. And I gave that report back to the Justice Department, and a few weeks later, the U.S. Attorney General went there and he observed some of the same conclusions. Sometime later, when I was headed to the U.S. Conference of Mayors, that awful dreaded attack occurred in Charleston, South Carolina. And my good friend, Mayor Joe Riley, was scheduled to be at that conference in San Francisco so that all the mayors whose lives he has impacted were going to honor him on that occasion. Mayor Riley could not attend because he had work back home in healing a city, a community that had been ravaged by the terrible mind of a young man who had gone into a church of worship and killed 9 individuals. And I think we all knew that what happened in Charleston could have happened anywhere. And it's not that you can prevent things from happening, but the question is, how do you respond to it? And the response that Charleston could have given would have been one of violence, It could have been one of attacking each other based on skin color, religion, personal beliefs, and a number of other things. But what you saw in Charleston was people of all colors, all religions, recognizing the humanity in each one of us and coming together, praying for that young man who committed that dastardly deed, recognizing that there are still problems in our society, but you cannot solve those problems by pitting violence against violence, but you solve those problems by coming together as one people. And so Mayor Riley did not make it to that event, but we gave honor to him in his absence. And I think you called in at that point in time, Joe, and we all said thank you. Thank you for the leadership that you were not only providing on that particular occasion, but the leadership that you had provided to this country down through the years. And so I'll close out my remarks at this point in time and ask my good friend, Mayor Joseph Riley, to please come forward and share with us his wisdom on leadership, his wisdom on bringing people together, and his wisdom on how we can strive forward together as a society. Thank you all so much.